welcome everyone as well. I'm really thrilled to have Sandrine with us today. The only way I can introduce Sandrine is to say she's a serious badass, and she's doing an incredible amount of work in the world, and is here with us today with a semi-broken foot that's causing her a lot of pain. So I sending my sympathy and empathy for you as you recover. And maybe I'll let you share the story if you feel like it as to how you did that. You didn't fall off your bicycle, but in all seriousness, I've gotten to know Sandrine really through the Club of Rome. And I think it's fair to say that her sheer will and force has put the limits to growth agenda, in a sense, on the agenda in a serious way, perhaps for the first time ever. The original book was written 50 years ago. And interestingly, with one of the original authors, Sandrine has given it a major update in the book Earth for All, and it was an entire campaign around the book that Sandrine was the lead author on, and really has changed the dialogue and conversation in many sort of senior circles of government leadership, really for the first time in the Club of Rome's history. Maybe that's exaggerating a little bit. I'm sure it got a lot of play initially, and then we sort of forgot about it. But at any rate, welcome, Sandrine, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, John. And I'm honored to be here with people from everywhere, from what I can see in the chat. So it's lovely to see some people from Europe and the US and elsewhere. And I think that you've kind of hyped me up a bit more than I deserve, for sure.
No.
But I appreciate that. It has been an absolute pleasure, first of all, getting to know you, and also being able to lead the Club of Rome into the next phase of what was very necessary at the time when I took the tenure already 6 years ago, which is,
yeah, I was just going to ask, has it really been 6 years? Wow.
It's been 6 years, and that's been baffling. At a time, I would say, when I think that many of us, as you rightly say, we're starting to forget what the Club of Rome was all about.
So maybe let's start there.
Yeah.
I mean, some people may not know the story. So why don't we just start real quickly with the history, if you can, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I think the beauty of the Club of Rome, and there are some skeletons in the closet. I'll start more with the beauty and the importance and the depth, which was really that this entire initiative and this club started with Aurelio Pache, who was an entrepreneur, who was an industrialist, and the former CEO of Olivetti. And what Aurelio saw as he was traveling across the globe was two key issues. One, growing populations, especially because he was traveling a lot to Asia, and the way in which that was really starting to put a stress on natural resources, and also huge impact on the environment. I mean, this was in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, and he could see that the pollution to air, water, land directly, and felt that there was a real need to start understanding, what is it if we continue to have perpetual growth? What is that going to do to our planet? I mean, how incredible that an entrepreneur had that foresight. And for me, it truly makes me think of some of the Renaissance thinking at the time. If you look at Bob Kennedy and his incredible speech on Beyond GDP, if you look at the fact that the Kennedys overall and some of the thinking in the late 60s and the 70s, you know, you saw this kind of juxtaposition of the Vietnam War and the hate and all of the things that were going wrong with the world. And then on the other side, these men and women who were trying to figure out, as we are now, and I actually think there's so much symbolism between that period and this period in our lives, when they were really trying to figure out, okay, well, what do we do? How do we bring love back into our lives? How do we think about a human revolution that is very different from what we're seeing today? How do we shift from conflict and hate and war into peace because he was having dialogues with spiritual leaders. And that was part of asking the right questions and unpacking the blind spots and everything that we're doing today, and that some people continue to do since then. But really, when you read some of those works, you think to yourself, this is quite extraordinary that this man had that foresight. Now, what did he do? He gathered decision makers and thought leaders around what he called the Club of Rome. And then in 1972, or prior to that in 1970, he commissioned a work from MIT Systems Lab to really start thinking through. And that's when he started working with the Meadows, thinking through, well, what is the possibility of understanding some different scenarios of how we can get out of the mess that we've created, and looking at social and environmental tipping points, predominantly focused on the environmental, less the social. And that's when we get to Earth for All and the work that we've done.
Yeah. And he referred to it as the problematique. Right?
Yes, the human problematic.
Yeah. Which in a sense is now what we call the polycrisis. That's the updated problematique that we need to solve. And we have, I don't know, I'm always amazed when I listen to Daniel Schmachtenberger describe the what he calls the meta crisis, and the enormous complexity, not just of the challenges, but of trying to find a plausible pathway out of the box we've created. And but anyway, I agree with you. I think the movement in the 60s and 70s was very much the first breath of what we're living in now. And, someday historians will have a theory on why that breath was extinguished and forgotten for decades while we played and danced. But
well, Reaganomics played some of it, the perpetual growth, the fact that actually things were going quite well in the 80s and the 90s. And so everybody just decided let's just push all those problems and those nagging human problematique issues under the carpet.
Right. So to bring us forward, so there was this, there was a series of systems modeling done by the MIT scientists. The modeling exercise, as I understand, was led by Dennis Meadows and
Dana. We really have to be clear that Dana was very actively involved
in the modeling. Yeah. But she was also the lead author of the book and is a brilliant writer in addition to a brilliant scientist. And unfortunately died way too young of a sort of a freak medical meningitis that she caught on campus at Dartmouth. Interestingly for me, I think the same year I left Wall Street is the year she died. So anyway, I never had a chance to know her. But so fast forward to Earth for All. Tell us again, just briefly, what is Earth for All, and maybe the summary of it was a modeling exercise again, correct? A systems dynamic modeling exercise, very serious systems modeling effort. And again, interestingly, worked on by one of the original authors of Limits to Growth, who's a
Jürgen Randers,
active member of the club, and then a book. And I think it's fair to say you were certainly the lead corraller of the process, and I would consider you the lead author of the process. But it was a multi-year effort. I have to say I participated just a little bit in it, but I have great respect for the effort that you personally put into it. So tell us a little bit about Earth for All, and then we'll jump into how it's being received in the world.
Sure. Before we get there, let me just add in a few bits and pieces, because I think that for those that are listening to our dialogue, I want to remind everyone, because I've been so reminded as I've gone through this process myself of kind of reestablishing the club and the unbelievable value of digging into that human problematique, as you so rightly said, John. First of all, the incredible publications that have been published as reports to the Club of Rome, and all of these are on our website, and I have now gone through them. And what I find phenomenal is that you can take pieces out of any of these publications and just put them into a PowerPoint presentation or any article or storyline today, and they fit.
Yeah.
So again, the fact that we've been asking similar questions along
Prescient.
this journey, and
Prescient.
yet we're still here. And that, I think, is a bit of it's a mind-blowing reminder
Yeah.
that really this is the time. This is now the decade of action. We have got to get our shit together. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second is that while we were going through the rethinking of a thrall, which was basically a supposed celebration of the limits to growth, because it was the 50th anniversary report, and you don't celebrate the fact that you actually didn't do what you were supposed to do. So I must say that I often say this was not a celebration, this was a commemoration or an understanding of, holy shit, here's where we are, let's do things differently and see if we can actually get something done now in this limited amount of time. But I think that there were two things happening at the same time. One was, how could we shift the incredible knowledge of the club and your knowledge and all the members of the club into a space where we could actually have more impact? So translating all the deep knowledge into impact. So that for me was fundamental. And that's what led to the thinking around Earth for All, which was we cannot let another publication sit around for another 50 years and not actually drive the change that we're calling for. So everything we did in thinking through Earth for All was about how do we actually have that impact? And how do we ensure that we tell a better story so that people actually listen? So this doesn't just become another book on a bookshelf, that this actually becomes now, and that's what it is, an initiative. So this happened during COVID. And of course, we were hoping that COVID, as well as a great moment of transformation, would somehow allow us to tap into people's subconsciousness and remind them that we can transform for the wrong reasons, but we can transform, and therefore build on that in terms of what we were doing through Earth for All. For us, what was important was to take the World 3 model into another space, adding some of the planetary boundary science obviously from Johan Rockström, who was par and parcel of the entire thinking in this program of work, but also new economists and scientists from across the globe, because we have to remember that it was MIT that produced the report, The Limits to Growth, but also that it wasn't really stress tested by the Global South. There was absolutely no interaction with the Global South, even though huge scenarios that were really calling on shifts within the Global South and the North. And so for us, it was one important that when we did the modeling, we would both look at impacts in the Global South and the Global North. So a full global model that would address today's human problematique, the social and environmental tipping points. And I really emphasize the social because I don't think we emphasize the social enough in the Limits to Growth. And to go through that system dynamic model and then stress test it, and that's what you were part of, stress test the whole exercise continuously by asking further questions from people who are on the ground, economists, scientists, decision makers. You know, Sharon Burrow, who used to run the International Trade Union Confederation, who could really help us in terms of labor issues, et cetera, and employment, and go through that process and then write the report, coming out with the two scenarios that we did, Too Little, Too Late, and The Giant Leap, looking at what then can get us to the giant leap with 5 key pathways, which are the turnarounds, which is to address poverty, inequality, empowerment, food, and energy, because that came out as the strongest pathways to enable us to actually move forward with an interlinked, I would say, knowledge that we needed to have deep systems change at the economic level and also at the financial level, but also at the governance level. So our leadership is crap, and we need the leaders that are going to lead us through this change. And what does that look like then in practice? And then the third pillar, and then I'll stop and we can further exchange. The third pillar was, okay, so we're going to publish this book, and we're going to think through how this actually can land with people. How do we then tell the story? How do we then bring people on the journey? What does that look like? And repackage that story for different audiences and use multimedia processes and engagement opportunities, including citizen assemblies, as ways to bring this out to the world. And I must say, it's really the second and the third pillar, so the engagement with the scientists, economists from all over the world, and then ensuring that we had a proper communications plan that was very different from the limits to growth.
Yeah, and that last piece, and we'll come to back to this in a second, is why on your biography, one of the items is leading difficult conversations.
Yeah.
But let's come back to that for a second. I just want to make sure that we all can kind of process the core content, and I think it's fair to say that there's a and I think you were referring to this earlier. There has been within the Club of Rome a big transformation during the time I've been a participant, which isn't very long, to bring in a much more diverse set of voices, particularly a diversity into the what we call the global South. I guess we should call the global majority, but that was very missing from the club.
Yeah.
Only 10 years ago, much less 30 years ago or 50 years ago. And I think it's fair to say, though, that the first of the transformations, which is to eliminate poverty, is not simply a nod to that politically correct statement. It's actually scientifically valid in the modeling that that's the essential thing to begin with. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Thanks for that, John. And I would add also that we have to remember that actually you're right. The Club of Rome was a group of very smart and out of the box white men.
Very white men.
Yes. And that when myself and Mampela were the first female co-presidents to be elected, we really did want to shift that into a much more diverse group. And what is important—
Mampela from South Africa.
Exactly. So Mampela from South Africa, who was the wife of Stephen Biko and part of the Mandela government as well. So it was quite an honor to be with her. And I often say that it was really one of many firsts for the club and for myself to, first of all, co-lead an organization with a woman who was 20 years my senior, representing the voice of Africa, myself from Europe. So there was both it was an intergenerational leadership, a female leadership, and also an intercontinental leadership. And I found that really enriching and necessary. And to come to your point on poverty, this was really the aha moment for myself and also for Johan in terms of the planetary boundary science, because what came out systematically through our well-being index and also our social tension index was that if we did not deal with poverty and inequality, the speed and scale of landing in the operating space of the planetary boundaries would actually be null and void. So basically, the speed and scale of action on planetary boundaries is inextricably linked to the speed and scale of eradication of poverty and inequality. So that was the first big aha moment, especially for Johan. And in fact, we're in the process now of preparing a big event in New York for Climate Week and for the UN General Assembly, because there's been a big pushback on the planetary boundary science from many of our global South leaders, because they feel that this is a bit of a Western plot to stop thinking about poverty and inequality.
Yeah.
And what we've been very quick to say is absolutely not. We have to anchor everything we do in moving towards decarbonization or getting within living systems, as you so often remind us. Anything to get back to living systems has to be anchored in ensuring that people have decent quality of life, and that is fundamental. And so the big second aha moment was all of our statistics and our data demonstrates that actually inequality is going up in the global north as much as it's going up between the global south and the global north and within the global south. So, you know what's happening in New York. I can talk about San Francisco. I'm actually so depressed every time I go back to California to see how the 80s and the 90s and 2000s left people behind. totally left people behind.
Yeah.
Trickle down never existed, and the disparity is growing everywhere, which leads obviously to the highest increase in mental illness we've ever seen, suicide rates, drug addiction, etc. So that was the second aha moment. And then maybe let me just bring the third aha moment,
Yeah.
which is now linked to the way in which we've engaged with citizens in our surveys. Is that last 2 years we've done global surveys with the G20, and that third aha moment linked to actually Earth for All has been that people fundamentally want a well-being economy. So in G20, so we started last year, it was 75%. This year we actually went down slightly, but incredible that people are asking for a well-being economy, and leaders continuously are pushing neoliberal growth models, capitalism, competitiveness continuously in order to really just foster their own power and profit motives than listening to what people's needs are.
There's similar polling data. Actually, Hunter just shared this with me. I'm sure you know this better than I do, but there's similar polling data from around the world that something like 80% of people want real action on climate change.
Yes. So this is coming from the same survey, I think.
Oh, is it? Yeah.
It's our Earth for All GCA data.
Okay.
Happy to share that with everyone as well. It's phenomenal, and we'll be launching that also in New York. And in fact, I think there's a webinar next week, which I can also put the details in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, we can share it around afterward.
Yeah, or you can share it.
Yeah. One other thing I just wanted to ask you to, so the turnarounds then are reduce poverty or eliminate poverty, reduce inequality, importantly, empower women. And you probably have a couple of thoughts on that. And then the final two are the energy system and the food system, which I don't think we need to, I think people kind of get that. So maybe just talk about the empower women thing. And again, I think most people know that in the original work in Drawdown, that essentially came out to be the most important thing we can do to deal with climate change. So again, these issues are inseparable, but share a little bit about what you learned from the actual modeling exercise.
Yeah, I think it's really those three key turnarounds that work in tandem. So the poverty, inequality, and women. One is, and I often say this, I mean, this is not just about quotas. This is ensuring that in the global south, in particular, women have access to education. Part of that is because we fundamentally believe that women are a part of the economy, even today, without necessarily having access to education. They're often the drivers. I mean, you know as well as I do in the food system, the amount of female farmers that don't have access to land, but yet are renting land and producing and generating a very important part of the economy, not to mention the care economy, which is a parallel economy, et cetera. So ensuring that women have access to education enables them to then be able to continue to promote a very different way of engaging with the economy. That's the first thing. The second is that the more women are educated, the less we have population growth, which, you know, is an issue in some areas because we need more population growth in certain countries. But clearly where we saw exponential population growth in some of the global south, although again, the numbers are starting to decrease, we realize that we really need to ensure that women feel that they have control over their lives and their bodies. Amazing that we're still having that discussion.
We have some issues about that here in the United States, I'm afraid.
I know, absolutely.
Oh,
but so that is,
I wish it were funny.
I know, I wish it were funny too, but thank God we've got some hope now in terms of our Democratic nominees. But coming back to the other part, what I often say is, you know, this fixation with quotas to me is really quite troubling, because this is not just about the quota system and talking about equality, even though it's fundamental, and don't get me wrong, it's a realization, a deep realization that if we want to move towards the values that we all hold dear, we need to have more diversity, cultural diversity, gender diversity in all decision-making processes. Governments, communities, our hospitals, our businesses, everywhere. And yes, we have a few glitches where we realize that women are basically continuing to foster more masculine patriarchal traits. But in many cases, we know that if we want to shift towards an economy that is fostering well-being, it tends to be generated by women who are actively part of that economy and also part of the decision-making process. So that is for us why empowerment was so important. And the fact that also, you know, when you look at the new economists that we have before us as well, many of whom are women, whether it be Mariana Mazzucato, whether it be our dear friend Kate with Donut Economics, whether it be some of the initial thinking that Hunter brought forward as well. I think it's so important that we also bring in new economic thinking. Jayati Ghosh, who's a top Indian economist and also teaching in the United States, who was one of the co-authors, and who's doing so much incredible work in this area as well.
And is it fair to say, though, that the way this showed up in the modeling is what I would consider, because I have to admit, I haven't actually studied the models, but the way it probably—
How is that possible? I'm kidding.
I know. The way I suspect it showed up is what I would call the first order effects, which is things like, you know, women having fewer children, and you can then, you know, project data that what that will imply. But to me, the real value of, and in my framework, this is the critical principle of balance. It's what you referred to. It's the feminine. It's the feminine way of being and thinking and being in the world, which would be very difficult to model, but unlocks potential in ways that I know is very real. And so I suspect that in particular, you know, if we called women's empowerment, you know, rebalancing the masculine with the feminine, I think the impact of that might jump to the very top of the list of in a sense, leverage points. But I don't know if it's ever possible.
Absolutely, John. No. Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I think that this is why it was interesting that Earth for All came out at a time that it did. I mean, when we started planning Earth for All, we didn't realize we were going to go into COVID, right? And then lockdown, and then all the incredible—
That's the limitation of planning and modeling.
Yes, yes. But then, you know, what was extraordinary is Zoom came along, and here we all are.
Yeah, right.
And we were still able to continue to write the book collectively with so many incredible people from across the globe. But what I wanted to share is that I almost felt, and I still feel today continuously, that what the model showed us was exactly what was playing out. If you looked at the multicolored faces that were in the hospital rooms, that were offering social services, that were becoming part of the economy, that were taking risks, it was women.
Yeah.
And so it was almost as if that was becoming so true in terms of our premise that, as you say, empowerment went far beyond just quotas and even a question around population. And let's be clear, we had to be very clear that you know, we're not going into a one-child policy because, as always, the Club of Rome is still accused of somehow having stimulated the Chinese one-child policy. We still have today Malay integrating into some of his speeches that we are the ones that are fostering abortion, that we are the ones that are going out and you know, paying for all of these women who are sacrilegiously killing their children. It's quite amazing. I mean, you know as well as I do that I have we have a staff of about 20 people at the Club of Rome. We're definitely not spending our time on that. But anyway, it was a real noble truth in terms of how all of a sudden what we were seeing in our modeling was coming out in reality. And I now see exactly the same thing in terms of poverty and inequality. And it's been very helpful in the way in which I can have my conversations with governments, including, you know, President von der Leyen. When the farmers went into the streets, or when we were looking at energy poverty, and people are saying, hold on, we've got windfall profits of 2.8 billion per day of oil and gas companies, and you're making us pay a high price for
Right.
our oil and gas and filling up at the pump and our heat, etc. And we can't afford it. At the same time, we've got inflation going up. Our quality of life is going down. I mean, these are things that she was hearing. And I could just point directly to the system model and say, we've just plotted this and we are showing you, here are some of the policy recommendations that will enable you to actually get out of the mess that's been created by very poor decision making, including not taxing what you need to tax.
Yeah. Let's shift then to talk about the process, the communication process. And, you shared with me a few anecdotes when we were chatting previously, sort of setting this up. But, just so everyone knows, this has been, I don't know what to call it other than a serious global campaign to bring the ideas in this book and from this modeling into, the quote unquote halls of power. And, my perception is that it's landed, like front page news potentially in Europe. I mean, there was a major conference that you can share with us, but it has not landed that way in the United States. As you know, the conversation in the United States is just insanity. But it certainly isn't yet about even the possibility of entertaining an issue like, an issue other than, is it better to have free markets or regulated markets? And is Trump better or is now Harris better for economic growth? And a little bit of inequality conversation thrown in the middle. But we are still in the quiet period between the original limits to growth and the Earth for All report in the United States, I'm afraid. But do share with us what this process of communicating this with quote world leaders has been like. And I know you'll be candid as you always are in forums. So I think this is really important and interesting for us all to take in and understand, because we're all here because we're in the system change business, and we all recognize we collectively don't really know how to do it, or what we think we know how to do isn't working fast enough. And you've had a real eye opener, I think, in what it's like to actually deal with at least sort of policy leaders, government leaders who you're trying to break down the barrier to. So share away.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I mean, I want to also, because someone put in the chat, Catherine Trebeck, and just mention that as Catherine and I have also been working together, one of the key points when we were talking about really focusing Earth for All on reaching a goal of well-being was that we had to think about different theories of change. And you and I have had that conversation as well. I mean, this cannot just be one model. It has to be about an endpoint. And so I think that the fact that we didn't just focus on one theory of change in Earth for All, and what we did instead was we said there are a series of potential models that are out there, all of which are saying we need to go beyond GDP, point number one, take into consideration environmental and social externalities, address the role of the state, and ensure that we bring people on the journey. So those kind of are the overarching prerequisites, and increase people's quality of life. I mean, that is fundamental. And so with Catherine and we all and others, one thing we wanted to do was make sure that we first of all also point to the incredible work of the well-being economy governments, New Zealand, Scotland, Finland, and Iceland and Wales, and that we really take that into account. And when we have conversations around Earth for All, that we continuously reference the governments that have been brave enough to start to move in that direction. Mm-hmm. And that has opened up really interesting conversations, because of course we have 5 examples. And we can start to say, and on top of it, we know that there are many countries that are starting to look at these examples. So that's the first thing.
I think just real quick, in case people aren't familiar, the well-being economy, if I were to simplify the essence of it, it's driven by this idea that GDP is the wrong indicator for success. and that governments should embrace a much more holistic understanding of what well-being really means. So it's a alternative goals to GDP in summary. That's what that's about.
Yeah,
And Catherine Trebeck has been one of the leaders bringing that idea into multiple governments, as Sandrine just mentioned.
And Catherine was also part of our Transformational Economics Commission. And so we wanted to make sure, as Kate was, and the donut, et cetera. So we wanted to make sure to bring in all this incredible body of knowledge, as well as, let's take the European Commission, for example, for the moment, and then we can talk about other governments that we've spoken to. The fact that actually there already were live conversations, as you say, a big conference, Beyond Growth, that had the first actually cross-party engagement across all the European Parliament parties to talk about what does this mean in practice. I've never seen such a large conference inside the European Parliament. It was phenomenal, packed to the hilt in all the major plenary rooms with live conversations, intergenerational, so exciting. And that was last year. And I think that we wanted to build on that. We wanted to build on what was happening internally as well, in terms of starting to come up with possible new indicators, which is being done actually by the Joint Research Center. So again, not just going in with our big boots, and I'm fundamentally against trying to just reinvent the wheel and then package it as your own theory of change. It drives me absolutely across, as you know, it makes me very angry. So this was a collaborative effort to go in and say, hey, we've got all these pieces that are moving in the right direction, including, by the way, Bridgetown Initiative, which was a big call for us, was we need to shift the financial architecture. And so pointing to Mia Motley's work around the Bridgetown Initiative and saying, there are big parts of our institutions and our governments that are moving in this direction. Debt cancellation, SDRs, thinking through how we can create that fiscal space so we can truly transition, including all of this work that's happening around the new indicators at the OECD, et cetera. So I'm not just going in and saying, hey, there were about 20 people that got together and produced a book, and we decided that we had a new theory of change that's going to convince all of you that actually this is the only way forward. No way. It was building the bridges with so many different initiatives and saying this is already happening. This is not just some kind of pie in the sky proposal. Building on short-term levers as well, because I'd been working on the taxonomy, as you full know. And yes, the taxonomy is nowhere near what we need, but it's a tiny little window towards change. Having enough knowledge to know that there are all these little building blocks that could be joined up and really shift the conversation. Now, what happened? 2 years ago, actually, I gave my copy of The Limits to Growth to Ursula von der Leyen, and I also gave her a copy of Earth for All. I now regret having given her my copy of The Limits to Growth because it was actually quite a prized copy. But in any case, I do think that up until the Ukrainian invasion, and in particular until Gaza, and just this last 6 months, there was a real move and an opening and a possibility to declare one of her major pieces of work as a Beyond Growth paradigm shift policy program. She was really primed. She was ready. And as I think many other leaders were. I mean, I even had conversations with Macron. We had conversations with the Pope, very different. Of course, again, with the Pope, it was leading it to his work on Laudato Si.
Laudato Si.
So, exactly.
By the way,
So
Laudato Si is more aligned with regenerative economics even than it is the sort of
agreed.
But that's another conversation.
No, but I agree with you. And again, aligning all of this to regenerative economics and also referencing the importance of regenerative food as well as economics, regenerative finance, which you and I have been talking about as well. So my big worry, before we get to the pushback now from some of the governments, is actually that there were too many messages out there. And so what I tried to do with all my discussions, hence why I think that those of us who were really rethinking through the Earth for All campaign, was to try to say, this is the end goal. And we have many pieces of that puzzle that are starting to come together. So let's build on them. Let's not reinvent the wheel. And my worry is we now see life economy, love economy, all these different economies coming up, which are kind of bringing forward similar types of thinking, which is great, but let's not then confuse things even more. Because, and here's the big issue, at least from a European perspective, the last 6 months, we've seen the big pushback from the radical right. And that big pushback from the radical right, in the same way that we saw it in the US with the way in which the Republicans had rallied so well against the Democrats around Trump. And now, luckily, we've regained that narrative. But let's be clear, the radical right is a hell of a lot more, first of all, financed and also simple in their messaging.
Yeah.
And what I was seeing was just this confusion of, in fact, President von der Leyen said to me, Sandrine, I love the idea of a well-being economy, but it looks like we're all going to the spa. And I cannot send that message to my traditional friends who are very Cartesian and also Calvinistic and have never even gone to a spa.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think this is one of the ways in which we were able to open up that conversation. And it worked. It worked also with a variety of different countries who have wanted now to engage. And we've already started with Kenya. We've got a national program that is running through Kenya. We've got a national program in Austria. We've got a national program that is starting in Argentina. And we also have the Ukraine that contacted us and said, we want you to help us rebuild Ukraine. And that's when I kind of had, excuse my language, a bit of a holy fuck moment where I thought, yeah, right. And then we've got BlackRock, who's your whisperer. And here we are, you know, the Club of Rome, Earth for All, the partners, trying to figure out how we can really support Zelensky in shifting the Ukraine into a direction where they could become the guiding light of what a new sustainable economy looks like. So many positive conversations, but I really believe that the combination, the compound effects of the Ukrainian invasion that is continuing on, the fact that we've had the radical right really push in the fear, and the fear mongering has been big, and the hate, and start to scare people into voting for the radical right, and Gaza, which has really tainted the US's, by the way, the US in a big way across the rest of the world, created very deep geopolitical divides, made it very difficult for Europe to actually align around more of a value-based economy with China, which it could have done because actually there were more similarities. So all of this has been
this whole they amended their constitution to be a what was it, ecological civilization.
Exactly.
Years ago.
Exactly. So this is very disturbing, and I think that we're not in a good place right now. I think that we've been boosted a little bit from the down of the European elections and also the French elections to the up, and Malay and all the other hate mongers that are out there, including Trump, by the convention, the Democratic convention that's brought back that breath of fresh air around let's not kill each other and hate each other, but actually try to love each other and respect each other. And the same with Olympics, believe it or not, where I fundamentally believe that the Olympics did the same. But I do think we're in a difficult place. And maybe I'll close with one last thought, which is the fact that the well-being economies, and this is a paper that Catherine Trebeck actually wrote for us that I commissioned for Earth for All as well, they're really suffering as well. New governments having a hard time staying with the well-being economy. Only Wales that has really put it into...
both in Scotland and in New Zealand.
Yes. Definitely, even also definitely in Finland as well. I think Iceland and Wales are staying the course.
Yay, Iceland.
Yay, Iceland, exactly. But
there's something about female leadership going on that there's a correlation to what you just, the ups and the downs there, just for the record. Sorry, finish up. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's all. I just want to say there is absolutely, although I have to say, that the Welsh have been led by an incredible male leader, and actually, even though Sophie Howe was there as kind of the futures commissioner, and there was a really nice mix of the intergenerational element and the future element in Wales, and also embedding everything in their constitution that has made, I think now, Wales as the real leader in terms of the way in which we move forward for a well-being economy.
So just before we open it up, because I'm sure there'll be tons of questions, I'll try to say this as succinctly as I can. For those who are sort of part of our regenerative economics course community, the way I think about this is that this progress is hugely and fundamentally essential as the big step to shift off of our, neoclassical GDP growth driven set of goals. But it's also, to be candid, frustrating for me because just as Sandrine said, the message needs to be simple and clear. And, this work of a living systems paradigm is a shift in the way we think about where our well-being comes from. It's not driven by new goals. It's driven by a new way of seeing the world. And that, that conversation can't happen yet in the halls of power that Sandrine has penetrated with Earth for All. And so, yet again, in my view, either I'm sort of, out in space and not only at the spa, but at the mushroom ranch with a spa, or we've still got another kind of comeuppance ahead of us, which is, these new goals and this well-being thing is all great, but how do we get there from here without crashing the economy? And I there's not time to have this conversation here, but I firmly believe, just so everyone knows where I'm coming from, is that this work is absolutely essential and needs to come first. And we're going to wake up in the future and realize we need to find new sources of prosperity that are going to not come from our reductionist, materialist way of seeing the world, but are going to come from a much more holistic, non-materialist, harder to quantify source. So anyway, let's open it up. I'm sure there's lots of comments and questions, and I'm just looking at the time. Sandrine, do you have an extra 5 or 10 minutes to stick with us? Is your foot too much pain?
It's okay. I've put it up, and my dog is here by me, giving me.
Oh, that always helps.
My husband, as you
Thank goodness for dogs.
The bark from the dog.
Dogs ahead of husbands usually, right?
Yeah. Well, no.
No. Okay, good.
I'm very lucky. I have a wonderful husband. But I wanted to add to that, John. I actually really agree with you, and I think the key question to all of us is, how do we create that inner development and that inner realization that we are tiny specks in a broad universe and part of a living ecosystem at a time when actually people are scared? I mean, this is the moment to do it. How do we transition? And I think that's the question I ask myself all the time. How do we really transition at this time where everyone is hunkering down in the real economy, when actually what they should be doing is questioning what the real economy is doing to their lives, because it's fucking everything up.
Yeah. Amen.